Josh. Josh loves drumming. When he's not practicing, he's performing. And when he's not performing, he's practicing. Oh, and did we mention? Josh loves drumming. And that's why he chooses D-Bud. Hey Josh, show us your skills. Thanks, Josh. Noise harms your health. Josh knows that. He also knows that gigs get very loud. D-Bud's volume slider means that he can slide from minus 11 decibels to minus 24 decibels in the flick of a switch. And that's why Josh loves D-Bud. The problem with cheap earplugs is they often kill both the volume and the sound. The lower tones cut through the earplugs more than the higher ones. The bass overpowers the treble. There's an uneven attenuation of high and low frequencies, an unbalanced distorted sound. Yes, they protect your ears, but you get a muffled and dull sound experience. D-Bud isn't like that. Don't lose your hearing or peace of mind. Get D-Bud today.
Music is important to me as a backdrop to my life, and when I'm working in particular. There's music that I listen to quite a lot of the time to sort of get me into the mood to write and just to provide a sort of a comfort blanket when I am writing. Or perhaps not a blanket, because that's something you pull over yourself, more like a pillow, something that I can rest against.
And in terms of, the type of music that you enjoy listening to, you mentioned that you're primarily a fan of classical music. Has that always been the case? Yes,
I was brought up in a sort of a very, I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but shall we say sort of slightly sort of elitist sort of family, where my father, who was very much into sort of classical books and classical music and classical everything really, would frown upon things like the Beatles, which was sort of just coming out when I was a young boy. That sort of music was something that was quite shameful and shocking, and what's going on here? So he was very much sort of more into sort of Mozart, Puccini and Verdi, and inevitably these have become my taste. So I hope I'm a little bit more sort of widely stretched than my father was.
And how do you consume your music? Do you stream? Do you listen to the radio?
I stream a lot of music nowadays. I mean, I was looking in my house the other day, looking at all the CDs that are still piled up in my cupboard and shelves, and thinking to myself, goodness, that was a very sort of fast technology. It was bad when it arrived, and it's bad now that it's gone. And I'm glad to see the back of it. But at the same time, I can't quite bring myself to throw them all away, because CDs, like books, are sort of, you remember when you bought them, and they sort of become your friends. But I fear I might have to do just that.
Yeah, it's kind of frightening the pace at which things are changing technologically. I mean, although the streaming bargain for us as consumers is incredible. Do you worry? I mean, there are some people in the creative arts, particularly in music, worrying about their ability to support themselves financially. Do you think that that's a kind of worrying situation in the music?
It is definitely an issue. That is absolutely correct. One hears about musicians and composers, people who've written songs, or people who are soloists in one form or another, or bands or whatever, who are being paid fractions of the amount that they should be, and their music is available to a worldwide audience and getting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of plays. And this is quite wrong. I mean, at this time even Brexit has made it more difficult now for musicians and independent singers and bands to earn a living abroad. And this will have to be addressed at some time. And if it doesn't, one fears for the future for live music.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the music industry has definitely been brought to its knees by the pandemic. So hopefully Spotify and the other streaming companies revise their terms of payment, because otherwise I think a lot of people will probably have to resort to doing something else with their lives.
Well, it could be argued that during COVID, the mega companies, the mega internet companies, the mega sort of corporations have not exactly stepped forward to sort of, to support people. People have got rich during COVID, and that is a shame, but there isn't a little more altruism in the mix, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. COVID seems to have been, it's obviously not been a pleasing situation for anybody, but in terms of, as you mentioned, a lot of people have kind of got richer, sometimes directly as a result of it, and it would seem that a lot of people who haven't missed out financially as well are kind of the first people to be very ardent in their views on policy. And you know, I think lockdown is the only choice personally, but at the same time, I do feel there could be more compassion for those people who've lost their livelihoods.
Well, compassion and support. I mean, I read a really shocking statistic this morning, which is that 10 people in the world have earned enough money during COVID to pay for the entire world's vaccinations. Think about that, 10 people. And I do think, and this is something that's happened in my lifetime. I mean, you know, there's always been a gap between rich and poor, and one has grown up with this, and people who are, you know, a lot of my wealthier friends are very altruistic and generous and kind and supportive and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, that gap has now become so insane, so vast, so unfathomable, really, that you begin to think to yourself that the actual capitalist system might actually be broken or fractured. And that's very worrying, as a thought.
Yeah, it's extremely worrying. And do you think that, is there a particular reason why perhaps more of this wealth isn't redistributed by these people? Is it just sheer greed? Is it a fear of losing it? Is it tied up in stocks?
No, it's not necessarily to do with greed. I mean, what they do with their money might be related to greed, but the making of money is not necessarily per se greedy. If you have a brilliant idea, and let's not forget that there are people, and you can think of who they are without having to mention names, who have had a brilliant idea. We've now moved into a society in which one brilliant idea brings you not millions, nor even hundreds of millions, but billions of pounds, and the money just never stops coming in. And so you can't fault the idea. I mean, people rail against certain internet services and say that life was better without them, but that's not true. These services succeed because they are brilliant. I mean, you know, I could say Amazon as one example of a business where it's incredible that here I am somewhere isolated and I can press a button on my computer and be reading the book or wearing the socks or boiling the kettle that will arrive on my doorstep tomorrow. I mean, that is an incredible operation, and Jeff Bezos deserves his success. Now, and I won't use pejoratives about him simply because he is so insanely rich. But I think that what has happened is that this sort of focus, this concentration of wealth, hasn't had yet a satisfactory outcome. I mean, you think about Google, another of these big major companies, that I am correct in thinking this, their motto was "Do no evil."
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure they've actually quite managed to live up to that. And it is very, very difficult to remain being good when you have this colossal James Bond villain style wealth. It just tilts things the wrong way. But that said, this is not a diatribe against wealth. It's not a diatribe against, internet companies, which I freely admit I use. It is just a sense that maybe on the other side of COVID, we will come to a realization that this actually is not sustainable moving forward.
Yeah, it isn't sustainable moving forward. And I heard, the sort of do no evil motto at Google. I gather that sort of has disappeared and not being replaced.
Well, probably if you type in do no evil into Google, you'll just get a blank page now. I mean, that's sort of the evil we now live with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, why do you think they removed it? I mean, maybe they just got tired of it.
I have absolutely no idea. I mean, companies change their policies and change their slogans and mottos all the time, but I wouldn't like to comment. I'd just get myself into trouble.
Well, yeah, for sure. But I was wondering, have you seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma?
I have seen that, yes. I found that quite hard going to watch in some ways, but it was very, very interesting and fascinating, yeah.
And
the world has changed, especially, I'm talking to you and I'm aware that, there's probably about 40 years difference in our ages. And it occurs to me that, that you're talking to somebody on the edge of the world. This is your world, and I'm being pushed to the edge of it because, it's a cliche that people of my age sort of feel a little bit alienated by the new technology. The old joke is you need to get a teenager in the house to sort of mend your computer and all the rest of it. But it is interesting from my perspective to see the world I grew up in, the world as it was when I was your age, and the world as it is now, and these extraordinarily powerful forces. That said, you see, and that's why I'm being a little guarded in this conversation with you. I think it's very, very easy for people who've gone into their 60s and beyond to think that everything is getting worse. So it wasn't like this when I was a child. We all loved each other and supported each other and things were much better. That's not true. The world is actually getting better every single day. That is what happens. The natural course of history is one of improvement and things getting better. As you get old, you come to think the exact opposite of it. But I always cling on to the hope that, that despite what I've been talking about with you, and I don't quite know why we've got onto this subject, but I cling on to the hope that out of all this extraordinary sort of new development, new technology, new ease of life, old values and humanity and sharing and compassion and helping people will still come to the fore. And you could think about Bill Gates, one of the richest people in the world, who has spent a very, very large sum of his money, fighting things like malaria in Africa and all the rest of it. So, I think that again, it's too easy to think of these mega internet industrialists as being just sort of Blofelds. They're not. I mean, a large number of them are in their own way doing good.
Yeah, and also I must kind of caveat, if it came across in my earlier remarks that I was kind of against the system through which people can achieve this extraordinary success and wealth, I'm definitely not. I think everybody should have the right to kind of work as hard as they want, achieve whatever they want. But it is, it is a question, should people do more? But I mean, again, you've pointed out Bill Gates, who's done a huge amount, and there's a lot to be positive about as well, which is kind of very helpful for you to be pointing this out.
I think so. I mean, I try to be, especially now, with COVID and everything, where everything, I've largely stopped reading newspapers because I'm tired of a constant appetite, a constant diet, that is, of bad news, a diet of people behaving badly, a diet of extremist politicians. I think that if you have a genuine belief, or if you can sustain a belief that people are basically good, that humanity is largely out to do good and to help and to be kind, that is how you will find life. That is a belief that I've come to in my age, that if you feel negative, if you feel pessimistic, if you feel down, then the world will often be that way. But maybe that's a little simplistic. I don't know.
No, I think mindset is a hugely important part of life. And I feel almost trapped. This is one of the pitfalls of social media, combined with lockdown, combined with, a kind of news cycle that is pretty, it's the most significant that it's been, certainly in my lifetime, is that it almost feels easier to be negative about things and to complain and to whinge and whine than it is to be positive. I don't know whether you find it that way, but I find it almost easier to be negative, especially if you get sucked into that cycle of negativity through overconsumption of news media.
Yeah, I think that, 24-hour news is a problem, because if you have 24-hour news, you have to have lots and lots and lots of stories to fill it. And by and large, since they were begun, newspapers have thrived on bad news. I mean, in my lifetime, there have been attempts to create newspapers that only printed good news. This is the idea that it would cheer you up. Nobody bought them. There is a need, I think, in human nature to empathize in some ways with other people's misfortunes. But the trouble is, if you've got a 24-hour news cycle that is constantly bombarding you with bad news, especially when most of your life has been taken away from you, it can have a very crippling effect. Added to which, we have just come out of the Trump era, where politics in America have I think, had a sort of a ripple effect throughout the world, an echo effect, you might say. I mean, I don't know about yourself, and maybe, because you're younger, you might be less sort of tempted to sort of, less, what's the word I'm looking for? You might be less affected by this. But I, from one, felt I felt a very slight weight off my shoulders once Trump had gone out of office, simply because there was a little bit less invective in the world, a little bit less insult, a little bit less hysteria, a little bit less anger. And just to have that section of it gone made me feel better about waking up in the morning and getting on with my day. And I think that, again, coming out of COVID, I hope that we will cling on to the need to be positive and to be kind to each other.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way about Trump being gone. My only concern with it is what will the press do? Because the whole reason, it seems, why he got into power is because he was kind of good for the ratings. So you would have seen at the start outlets who now would, kind of refuse to give him any coverage of a positive nature, and probably actually would refuse to give him that much coverage unless it was very, very negative. But outlets like ABC and CBS and places like that, they kind of covered Trump as a bit more of a novelty figure back at the beginning in 2015. And they benefited hugely in terms of ratings and stuff.
It was a huge
how are they going to fill it?
A huge mistake by the American media to acquiesce to Trump from pretty much the beginning. They all knew perfectly well in the primaries, when he was a candidate and every Republican was saying that he was hopeless and mad and bad and would be useless as a president. They all knew that was the case. But once he became the president, I never quite understood why they played the charade they did. The White House press briefings, which were nonsensical. They were being lied to time and time again. They were being insulted. They were being told nothing of any import or value at all. And yet they still sat there. They still played the game. They still printed the results or screened the results of what happened. And I thought to myself, why do you not en masse just quit this and leave it alone? Of course, you've answered the question, is it was selling newspapers to both people who hated Trump and to people who loved him. I mean, it was a sort of a bonfire of the vanities. And yet it led to, obviously January the 6th was the sort of, was the inevitable climax of the Trump years. I'm personally quite surprised that it wasn't actually worse. There weren't, people are forgetting, and it's extraordinary now, but the media have seemed to have rode back on the fact that 6 people died. 6 people died in the Capitol on January the 6th. We know one of them was a policeman, but we don't know anything about the others. Nobody seems to care about the fact that there are dead people there. It's just been sort of forgotten in the sort of this machine that has stampeded on. Very strange. Yeah,
there's not been any particular. I think there was coverage of one lady, I think, who died.
There was the lady who was shot. I mean, this is another thing, incidentally, which I was quite horrified by, that if you wanted to see a human being shot in the head and bleeding to death on your screen, it was widely available. The lady storming through the door of the Capitol. And that, again, is a new low in the media world and an indication of perhaps where we're going, that now death is no longer taboo. Violent death is something there as part of the news cycle. Again, this has been something that's changed over my life. And in some ways, of course, I am very pro being allowed to see anything we want to see. But at the same time, it is quite disturbing and shocking and not good for you to see these things on the screen. We're talking, I suppose, in this conversation largely about the way that the sickness that can come to us and make us less happy as human beings from the media and from the news, from politics, from the pace of the world and all the changes that are happening. And that certainly is going to add to that. So, yeah, I mean, it's been very, very strange. And it'll be interesting to see now what the media does with a boring president. I mean, Biden is many things, but one of them is that he is quite sort of uninteresting in his delivery. And everyone is saying this is wonderful, this is what we now need. But again, you do wonder, how will all these stations fill their airtime? How will all the newspapers confect their rage?
Yeah, it will be very interesting to see that. And I mean, before this year, before lockdowns, I must confess, I was somewhat apolitical, uninvolved, not drawn into any of this, really. It was only due to the lockdowns and due to everything else that I've sort of followed politics more closely. And when Biden initially ran, I sort of thought, being the unknowledgeable person I was about politics, I was like, it wasn't that guy VP sort of, 12 years ago. Isn't he too old now? That was my initial reaction. And of course, he's been elected and he will hopefully calm tempers out there, but he's going to be less incendiary and therefore less, the whole thing turned into a joke. It turned into reality TV. Like, it turned into it felt like a work of fiction, a work of like disturbing fiction, real life.
And sadly, don't talk about it in the past tense, because it does continue even though Biden is in place now. I mean, to listen to some of the Republican senators speak and to listen to the madness of what they're saying, the big lie still about the election results and the question of what should happen to the people who stormed the Capitol and whose fault it was. You get a senator saying, well, actually, it was the media's fault. And another senator saying, actually, it was everybody's fault. Let's leave them alone. And you get people saying, well, it's better to move on. Let's bury the hatchet. Let's have peace. Let's have unity. And then again, I say to myself, but hold on a minute. People died. There were people murdered and killed. You can't, just for the sake of unity and for the sake of peace, pretend that didn't happen. But that's, I think, is what they're trying to do. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few months.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully, the way that you said that it was important to remain positive, I mean, I have to say it was a pretty handy reminder from my perspective, because I do see very little. Is this something that's become more prevalent? I see very little in any broadcasts that I consume about positivity, about trying to remain happy and contented and fulfilled.
Well, you're talking to somebody who deals in fiction, don't forget. I mean, you know, my job in life is to write entertaining mysteries and murder mysteries and adventure stories and dramas that just keep people amused and entertained. That's what I do for my living, and that's therefore how I try to lead my life. But you know, I don't know. I mean, you know, in a funny way, I mean, this conversation has gone down corridors I hadn't expected. I thought we were going to be talking about Chopin and Bernard Herrmann, etc. But I do try to be happy and to remain happy, and I think that's again something about my age, which is that it's all too easy, especially when you get a little older, to just sit there and say the world has got worse and worse, and it wasn't great when I was a kid. It wasn't, and it isn't.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We do tend to glorify the past, and this podcast, you know, is greatest music of all time. But it always just kind of flows into whatever subject, and of course, someone like yourself, you know, it's pretty interesting to get your views on a variety of
I'm very happy to share them with you. And I want to say something else as well, which is I always have had great belief, because of my work writing Alex Rider and writing for young people and visiting so many schools and meeting so many young people, and now talking to yourself, that I've always had this sense that my generation has not been good for the world. I mean, and something has happened between 1955, when I was born, and now, which has been oddly destructive, and it's been my generation's fault. And I'm talking about things like the environment, I'm talking about politics, and I suppose, and about attitudes to people and wealth, all these things we've actually been discussing. And I, at the same time, do have a very, very great belief that your generation, with the new technology that is coming your way, and with the with the sort of aspirations that my sons and their friends all seem to have, will somehow make things better. We just need to get out of the way.
Well, I don't know. I'd say your generation has brought a lot of great things.
Well, you know, my parents' generation, of course, you know, fought a Second World War, and I have had a lifetime of undiluted peace and prosperity. And I think that what is sad is that I don't necessarily think that my generation has banked that peace and prosperity as well it might. And I think that what we could have perhaps done more is to consider the next generation. After all, your generation is said to be the first generation that is less well off than the generation before it, in terms of house ownership and income and job security. And now with COVID, of course, you know, whole careers have been stymied and put on hold for a year or two, hopefully not more than that. And I do sometimes think that that's been a little unfair, that you know, I have two sons who are your age, and my impetus now is hopefully that, you know, I worry less about me and more about them, which is another natural part of the aging process. Yeah,
for sure. Do you think that climate change, I mean, how knowledgeable are you on climate change? Because I've interviewed some people who have come from quite scientific backgrounds, who have said, you know, climate change is a grave problem, but they think that we're going to be able to handle it. Whereas some people are being far more, you know, negative and are rightly perhaps worried about it. Do you think it's going to be sort of the major problem of our generation, and almost, you know, coronavirus isn't a distraction, but it's another huge addition to this grave problem that we've kind of got staring us in the face?
I'm not well enough informed. I mean, obviously I read as much as I can and talk and listen and see, but hear podcasts and programs and everything. I'm in no position to give a forecast as to where we're going. I think it is fairly obvious that global warming is a major issue and is going to be one of the big issues that will face your generation. I think one of the biggest problems has been persuading people of that and actually persuading people to take action. And I think the sort of action that needs to be taken is not the obvious things. It's not just about air travel or cars or you know, the fuels that we use. It's as much about what we eat and how we treat our resources. You know, the meat is I think one of the sort of the major issues facing your generation as to whether meat is a sustainable food product for your generation. I think that you are going to have at some stage to have to ask some serious questions about how you handle the world and its resources. But at the same time, I have every confidence you'll come up with the right answers. You, meaning your generation.
Yeah, of course. And the meat question is actually a particularly interesting debate, and yeah, it's difficult to know on that.
You know, the trouble is, you know, you're talking to me as if I'm some kind of expert or anything, but I'm not. You know, I was thinking about the meat thing only because it occurred to me there might be quite an entertaining novel to write, in which it would be like one of those 1920s prohibition type books, you know, where you have a speakeasy hiding behind a fake wall in a tailor shop or whatever. But in the future world, that wall will slide open and people will be eating meat on the other side, and gangsters, instead of dealing in illegal alcohol, will be dealing in illegal sausages and chops. And I thought there was perhaps a story to write about that at some stage. It's just one of the ideas that's in my head.
I think that would be an amazing story.
Well, I probably won't write it because I don't tend to do that sort of science fiction type, fantasy type things. But you know, where I would then become an expert is if I was going to write it, I do the research and I'd then be able to talk to you in a much more convincing way about you know, whether or not we should be eating meat.
I think that's such a good idea for a book, but you know, I'm sure you're.
Please, are you a writer? Are you a writer as well as a broadcaster and a journalist?
I'm kind of toying with the idea of writing something, but I'm not a writer by any stretch of the imagination. It's one of the few things I get complimented on, and perhaps, you know, I've dipped my toe into musical waters to varying degrees of success, and but I've always tended to be more complimented on my writing than on my music. So, you know, I'm thinking.
If you choose to write that book, you're very welcome to that idea.
Absolutely not. I can't. You know, I can't. Particularly as there's now, you know, video evidence of the fact I've stolen the idea from Anthony Horowitz. So I wanted to make sure that I give you some opportunity to talk about some of your favorite music. You mentioned Chopin there. Would you say that he is one of your favorite kind of composers?
I love Chopin. I always have done. I play Chopin. I play the piano. I don't play it very well, and Chopin is incredibly difficult. So I have to be very careful just to choose the occasional nocturne or prelude that I can actually get my fingers around. But I love to listen to his music as well. I think great music like that, there is something quite magical about it. The fact that, you know, I always say that I deal in words. I've for all my life, I've just dealt in words, and words is quite common currency. I'm not putting myself down. I'm merely saying that everybody on this planet uses words, so do I. But to be able to take musical notations and to create from them these extraordinary flights of imagination and fantasy that take you to places that just, you know, are almost beyond comprehension, and why it has this effect on someone like me or on you. And that's what Chopin does for me. So I listen to an awful lot of Chopin and constantly playing Chopin in the background when I work. I listen to Philip Glass a lot. I don't know if you know him. He's a minimalist composer. He's called the composer for writers because his music, it's deceptively simple, but it's music that writers can use because you don't have to focus on it. And when I'm working on a novel, I'm not actually wanting to listen to words. I'm not wanting to listen to a symphony necessarily, which is complex and takes my emotions away from me. I want something that focuses me. So I listen to a lot of Philip Glass, but I also listen to a lot of opera. Especially when I'm not writing, I like to listen to opera. Puccini, Verdi, Mozart, of course, Bizet. I listen to film music a great deal. Bernard Herrmann, I think I've already mentioned in our conversation. Nino Rota, Ennio Morricone are three of my favorite film composers. Again, film music is very good for writers because it provides, I described it as a cushion. I could have said it's like a backdrop. It's something that just sort of surrounds me and focuses me. So I listen to that as well. I listen to a certain amount of jazz and some pop music. Which I shouldn't mention. It'll just make all your people of your age wince, like sort of, you know, God, how can he like that sort of stuff? But
no.
Well, I mean, you know, God, I don't know. I mean, I like to listen to Adele. I quite like listening to. I loved Amy Winehouse, her music. I still love her work and her music. Take That, for how goodness help me. I thought that track. Did I have it when I was on Desert Island Discs? No, I don't think it was out then. The Flood, I think, is an extraordinary song, and I listen to that lots of times, and it sort of just takes me to strange places.
That was on the Robbie Williams comeback album. Yeah, Adele and Amy Winehouse are extraordinary. They're so talented. Well, I mean, Amy sadly passed away, but
yeah, I know. It's a brilliant documentary about her, which I watched recently.
Yeah,
you can see it. So, you know, that's some of my taste. I mean, that's some of the music I listen to.
And how long have you been playing piano for?
Well, I went to a prep school when I was 8 and had piano lessons with a sort of the usual sort of Martinette, who or Martinet, I should say, who would sort of do her best to make the piano lessons as ghastly and as dreadful as possible. So I would give up, and I didn't get very far with her. But I continued to play in my secondary school, and then I suppose I played all my life. Actually, in answer to your question, I'm not good. I mean, it's an interesting thing that when you play the piano, I mean, it's quite interesting. You know, you're playing a piece by Chopin, and you've got sort of, you know, there's this great gap of time and distance and genius. He's a genius and I'm useless. But nonetheless, we're connected because I am playing what he wrote. I'm reading the notes on a piece of paper, and my fingers are, to a certain extent, interpreting these extraordinary pieces of music. And I get a great sense of excitement out of that. I mean, imagine if you could connect with a painter in the same way, or connect with a writer even. But you can't, but you can if you play the piano or play a musical instrument. You are actually connecting with genius, and I feel it. And I'm aware that my inability to interpret it is nothing to be ashamed of. It's something that I just enjoy doing. That said, if I had a piano here and you asked me to play something, I would find an excuse not to.
But I mean, you know, if you're playing stuff like Chopin, and you've been playing for a while, you're probably much better than you say you are. How often do you play?
Every day.
You play every day?
Where I'm talking to you now, I don't have my piano. It's the one thing I'm missing is my piano. But in London, when I'm in London, I play the piano every single day. For about an hour every day. For
about an hour every day?
No, it's a sort of relaxation. I go from one keyboard, my computer, to the other keyboard on the piano. And it just allows me to sort of leave the writing behind and focus on something else. And I think it's also terribly important, particularly as you get older, to just keep your brain challenged and exercised. So I learn languages, I play the piano, I read, I go to the theatre, cinema. I try and have new experiences. It's again, so much of our conversation has been about sort of where we are in the world, where you are, where I am, and part of it is to I think never to accept that this is it. Keep going, keep developing.
Yeah, it's very important, and of course, that's definitely something that you've adapted to your or brought certainly to your career as a writer, where you've been kind of extraordinarily prolific, as well as, of course, successful. How do you manage to write so often? I mean, is this a fairly full-on schedule that you have of writing?
I write all the time. I mean, I write 8, 9, 10 hours a day. I'm always writing something. Actually, I'm not at the moment. Funny enough, I finished a new novel yesterday, so I'm now going to take a few days off before I start the next one. But it's I love writing.
Days off.
What do I do? What?
A few days off.
Yeah, I might take a day or two anyway, and then I'll start the next one. But it's what I love. I mean, it's just I'm very lucky because I only have one skill and one talent, and it's sustained me my whole life. You, I'm sure, have many.
No, I'm what they call a jack of all trades, master of none.
Oh, don't ever say that. I'm sure it's not true.
No, I think it's being self-effacing is better than being extremely arrogant, as Mr. Trump will have proven for us all.
But at the same time, I always get a bit. What's the word I'm going to use? I always recommend
being honest about
young writers not to put themselves down, because actually, the number of people who come to me and say, "Look, I'm writing a book. It's not terribly good, but or I want to be a writer, although I'm not actually that great at it." I want to say to them, I've spent my whole life fighting against people who tell me that my work is not good, or people who don't believe in me, always having to prove myself. And the one person I never allow to put me down is me.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice. I mean, I think it probably is despite my insincerity there, I'm confident in my abilities, but I am not. One thing I'm not confident of. I mean, it's not like I'm trying to be a writer. I vaguely might dip my toe in the water, but I'm just saying, in general, for people in creative arts, of any kind, podcasting, whatever it might be, it does seem, even people with success, it seems like it's a very oversaturated landscape right now because of the democratization of putting content out there. Everybody can do it. There are no tastemakers or people signing musicians anymore in the same way. You can just put music out there. You can write anything you want. You can do whatever you want creatively, which is wonderful, but has also led to a huge oversaturation of the market.
Yes, although when I was young and growing up, I mean, people would complain that publishers had too much
Power.
Control over what was too much power. That's right. It was too hard to break in if you didn't know the right people. You know, how did you get your manuscript in? How did you become a bestseller? Why was it that this writer gets all the advertising and I get none? So that democratization does create other problems, but it also has other opportunities and benefits. I mean, I am very old-fashioned, of course. I still have a publisher, and I still produce X numbers of books a year, and you know, and they go into shops, and they sit on tables. So it's not sort of, you know, I'm not a digital modern writer, and of course, I'm grateful for it. I'm not sure how I would fare given the world that you have to contend with. But you know, again, it's my belief that good work will always come out. Good work will always be discovered. It's what I try and tell young writers. It's believe in yourself, write the best you can, and if your work is good, if it's commercial, if it's what people want, it will find its audience. I mean, it took me a very, very long time to find mine. I mean, you know, I was an overnight success, but the night lasted 20 years. You know, I think hanging in there is part of it too. But as I say, I'm not sure how I would manage in the world as it is now, or if I'd have been given the number of chances I was given you know, when I started. It took me a long time before I actually wrote a bestseller, but I got lots of books published.
What would you say was the major sort of turning point en route to you achieving your success initially?
Alex Rider, Stormbreaker, 2001. That book came out and changed my life. Suddenly, the glass ceiling broke, and I started selling. Instead of 5,000 or 10,000 books a year, 25, then 50, then 100, then, you know, up to 100,000, 200, etc. I mean, that was just the beginning of a sort of a rolling, the whole, you know, that's when my career took off.
Really? So before that, you wouldn't say your career had taken off that much?
Well, no, I mean, I was doing okay. I mean, I had written like about 10 books for young people before then, most of which are still in print today, which is sort of pleasing. I had a television career at that time. I was doing Robin of Sherwood, and I think at that time was I writing Poirot by then? I can't remember, but I had a fairly successful TV career. Yeah. Things were doing quite nicely, but if you're talking about life-changing sort of, you know, the book that actually, because I think that was your question of what changed my life maybe into a sort of more of a known factor. It would have been Alex Rider.
Yeah, nice. I remember reading and loving that book, but you know, I guess it is a major turning point when you go from successful to sort of like extremely successful. But
don't get me wrong, it isn't a case of suddenly becoming, you know, massively rich or massively well known or having sort of, you know, a Rolls Royce parked outside or anything like that. It's just a case of security, of knowing that there is an audience for your books, and that the audience is a big audience, not a small audience, and that publishers will continue to publish you. I don't even really have that because I'm still nervous every single day. I mean, you know, every writer fears being found out the day when people will wake up and realize that you are no good after all. That comes with being a writer, but there is definitely a league table, if you like, that you can break into. And with Stormbreaker, I began to sort of, you know, to do sales that I hadn't seen before.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
I will just add one other thing. Forgive me jumping in, but not much changes. I'm still sitting by myself at a desk in a room. I mean, you know, that's what I've done for 40 years. Just it's a slightly bigger room and it's got a nicer view.
Yeah, does that ever? I mean, presumably you must really like that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be your passion, your vocation.
I love writing. I love telling stories. I love adventure and suspense and escapism, and I love the pleasure that reading brings. I think, you know, especially during COVID, everyone has discovered that, you know, the only great escape has been through books, television to an extent, I suppose, but really books. I love the fact that I meet people like you who read and are now doing well in your careers. And I like to think to myself, well, maybe one molecule of your success is my, you know, is my input. I'm not going to say more than that, but a molecule can still, you know, one molecule in a compound can change it completely. If it's, I think so. I mean, that's a nice thought to have.
The solitary aspect of it, though, does that ever get to you?
Yeah, sometimes I've been alone, completely alone now for 6 weeks because my family is in London and I'm here. And that's sort of that's been quite an interesting experience to have. it's sort of solitude within solitude, because I'm always alone anyway. Even if the family's in the house, I'm still on my own. But that's the one bad thing I think about being a writer, is that solitude, is that endless hours and hours alone. And I don't regret it. I mean, it goes with the job, but it's your feelings can become amplified. If you're sad for some reason, spend the whole day by yourself, you're sadder.
Yeah. No, I can, I can envision that might be the case, especially if you're trying to work. The book that I read of yours first was The Falcon's Malteser.
Oh, well, you'll be glad to hear about the book. How lovely to hear that. That takes me back a bit. The book that I finished yesterday, I mentioned, is a new Diamond Brothers book. I've actually written a book called The Seagull Has Landed, and it's the first Diamond Brothers book I've written for, I think, about 8 or 9 years actually. And I started writing it during COVID. I pushed it out onto my website free for kids who weren't at school and everybody in lockdown. And then I said I would finish the book and give the proceeds to charity, and that's what I've just done. And so I'm going to give all the money to a Suffolk charity, and the book will come out later this year.
Wow, that's going to be awesome. I mean, that book really, you talked about the, having a molecule of people's success and stuff, and definitely influencing people. That was, I just remember reading that. I would have been a kid, and just how wildly imaginative it just felt so brilliant, and I'm not pulling your leg on that. Do you have a favorite? Because obviously you write a lot of series, is it like asking a musician to choose between their albums and asking someone to choose their favorite kid? Is it just impossible?
Yeah, it would have to be Alex Rider, I suppose, because it is sort of, that was the changing of my life. And I've written, how many now? Sort of 14 of those books. It's been 2000 to 20 years of my life, and it's sort of been just such a roller coaster. And I like Alex. I think he's an interesting character. As I speak to you now, we've just started filming the second season of Alex Rider on Amazon, which is exciting, with our Otto Farrant playing Alex. And so it's very, very much part of my life still. I have a great fondness for my Power of Five books, and I keep hoping that one day somebody will film those. There are 5 of them in that set, and they, if you like, set out my view of the world. Alex is an adventure. Alex is escapism, but the Power of Five is a darker series, and although it's still adventures with magic and witches and all that sort of stuff and demons, it's sort of, I think it's about the world that finally has arrived. Actually, I think that's what I was writing about, but I wrote about it before it happened. And I'm very fond of those books. I mentioned to mention them now only because if Alex is my favorite, those are my favorite manqués, the ones that should be they should be better known.
And in terms of, when Alex Rider turned into such a phenomenon, was that something that took you by surprise, or did you kind of think when you'd written Stormbreaker that you were really onto something, and that this could be a big turning point?
I knew Stormbreaker was a better book. I knew Stormbreaker would find a bigger audience. I knew I'd done something different, and I'd done it well. I was still am quite surprised at how big Alex Rider has been. I mean, it's again, it comes back to the fact that I'm just sitting in a room here by myself, but 19 million copies of those books are meant to have sold around the world. And if you think about that, if that was in front of my window, that'd be a very big pile of books. And it is funny to have written for so many years and to have met so many people who've read my books and to feel, wow, that was me. And sometimes I can't do that. Sometimes I look at myself and I think, actually, maybe it has nothing to do with me. Maybe it's sort of just something that just happened near me. It's sort of interesting. It's sort of weird to think, no, that I wrote that. Those are my words.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fantastic book, and but still, I have to say, maybe The Falcon's Malteser would pip it for me.
I'm delighted to hear you say it, Tara. And as I say, I haven't got a new one. If you have my email, send me your address, and I will remember to send you a signed copy of the Seagull Landed as soon as it comes into print.
Thank you very much, Anthony.
My pleasure. Thank you for this interesting conversation.
So I've got a question regarding, writing and advice for people, kind of, younger writers and creative people in the creative arts, which is, what are the pieces of kind of tangible advice that come to mind first regarding, you know, how you think you've managed to attain success and attain that consistency, that longevity, which is so impressive.
You're saying advice for young writers starting out, basically.
Yeah.
Read is my first piece of advice. I'm amazed how many people write books but don't actually read a lot. And to read wide, read good literature, read pulp literature, read anything that you enjoy, but keep reading. Reading is it's a gymnasium for the mind, and it'll get you going. My second piece of advice is, I suppose, experience life. You can't sit in a room doing nothing and then write an interesting book. Get out, have fun, have adventures, find things to write about, travel. Once you're allowed to travel again, use experience. Experience is the fuel for a writer. Two more pieces of advice, then I'll stop, don't worry. Enjoy your writing. That's the most important thing. If you're not enjoying it, I always say something has gone wrong. And just immerse yourself, enjoy the feel of it. And finally, I've already said this in a way, is believe in yourself. Don't put yourself down. Believe in yourself. Have self-confidence, because goodness knows, you know, there are times in my life when I have doubted myself, but only briefly. And I power through it and say, this book's going to be great. This is going to be the greatest book ever. It's going to sell 10 million copies. It's going to change the world. And it doesn't do that, but that's a drive. That's a feeling with every word that I write. I
think those are very, very valuable pieces of advice. And
well, I'm not so sure. I mean, you know, it's easy.
Some of which I forget to do.
You know, I could add other things about structure and plotting and this sort of stuff, but that's not what your podcast is about, I don't think. Anyway, I do talks in schools sometimes and talks online and about that.
That advice was better as well for kind of more generally across creative arts.
Everything. It's true for everything in life. Whatever you really want to do is just stick with it and believe in yourself.
100%. So as this is the greatest music of all time podcast, I wanted to finish by asking you, is there a piece of music that you would really recommend, perhaps one that you've been listening to of late quite a lot?
Well, just to recommend to people to cheer them up in these times, maybe a piece of cheerful music. I don't. Let me think. I should have prepared this, actually. I've come and turned on the computer without really thinking too much. I'll just go for Chopin. I'll go for the Revolutionary Study by Chopin. If you listen to that piece of music and listen to how fast the fingers are moving and listen to what the composer is demanding of the player and how the player is responding, I think you can only smile at the sort of how great humanity can be.
Well, I'm looking forward to listening to it, because I don't listen to enough classical music, and certainly, you know, I'm not knowledgeable enough about Chopin. But Anthony, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I'm really looking forward to reading the new book as well.
It's a pleasure, Tom. Thank you.
If you're enjoying the Greatest Music of All Time podcast, you can keep up to date with all of our latest episodes for free by subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, the subscribe button is located at the top of the Tom Cridland YouTube page. It's also at the bottom right of any video that you watch on YouTube. If you're listening on an audio platform, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe at the top of the page.